you remind me of my movie experiences. Then, as now, I'm a great movie fan. And when I was old enough to go out by myself, I used to get my pocket money and go to the movies, usually Saturday afternoons, by myself in the neighborhood, right near that gymnasium. And one day, I came to my favorite little movie house, second-run movie, not one of those big palaces. And I see a sign in the window where the lady sits in the glass box office, right there where the show times are. And it says very politely in German, Juden unerwünscht, Jews not wanted. Not prohibited, it was not a prohibited, but it was a sign that said Juden unerwünscht. And so, standing there with my money in my pocket, having carefully planned what movie to see, what time to go, all by myself on the sidewalk looking at that sign, I had my first identity crisis as a Jew.
I've been thinking about that sign a lot lately. Jews not wanted. It didn't say forbidden, just unwelcome. And I've been thinking about that 11-year-old boy standing with his money in his hand, alone on the streets of Berlin. That boy who would grow up to be my grandfather, Fred Marcus, a blessed memory. That boy who felt at that moment like he did not belong. That boy who was made to feel like a stranger in his own land. 2 times our Parsha tells us, do not mistreat a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in Egypt. Our ancestors stood at Sinai and received the laws, the mishpatim, for establishing a just and righteous society. And this commandment is repeated at the beginning of the passage and at its end. Do not mistreat a stranger or oppress him, for you were strangers in Egypt. Jews have always known the feeling of being strangers, even before our sojourn in Egypt. Lech lecha, God says to Abraham and Sarah, go from this place you call home and cross the river and go to a new land that I will show you, and only there, in the place where you are strangers, will you become a people. At first, this people are called Ivri, Hebrews, literally boundary crossers. This is our burden. Ours is a faith born from the experience of the perpetual outsider. And now in Sinai's shadow, the people become a nation with rules that define righteous living. And these laws are bookended with this commandment, do not mistreat the stranger, for you have been strangers. The second time, the commandment goes even further, adding this phrase, ve'atem yadatem et nefesh hager, for you know the nefesh, the spirit, the soul, the heart of the ger, the stranger, for you are strangers. According to Nachmanides, God says, when you were strangers in the land of Egypt, I saw the ways the Egyptians oppressed you, and I avenged your cause on them, because I behold the tears of those who are oppressed and have no comforter. The stranger's life is perilous. The stranger is vulnerable without the supports or the comforts of home. The stranger has no advocate, no defender. The stranger is subject to the impulses, the prejudices, the oppressions of the powerful. We Jews have known the loneliness and vulnerability of the stranger's experience all too well, not just in Canaan or Egypt or Germany, but every place where we have lived. Our history is littered with signs that read, Jews not wanted. The stranger's life is lonely. Nachmanides explains, every stranger feels depressed and is always sighing and crying, and his eyes are always directed towards heaven. Therefore, God will have mercy upon him, upon all who are oppressed. God sees the plight of the stranger. God knows that a stranger has nobody to speak for him, nobody to defend him, nobody to turn to when he is treated unfairly. And God has vowed that if they have no recourse, then God will be their recourse. God sees them as they lift their eyes heavenward and hears their wails, and God answers their calls. Our Parsha tells us that God has placed within our people the heart of a stranger so that we might hear those calls too. The Talmud relates that once Rabbi Yosef was walking through the ruins of Jerusalem after it had been destroyed by the Romans. Just then Elijah the prophet walked by and asked, "What are you doing in this ruin?" Rabbi Yosef replies, "I came to pray." "And what did you hear when you prayed?" asked the prophet. "I heard God's voice, cooing like a dove and saying, 'Woe to me, that I raised my house, burned my temple, and exiled my children among the Gentiles.'" Elijah replies, "It is not just here and not just now that we can hear God, but whenever we pray or study, there is the potential to connect to these whispers of God." Rabbi Yosef in his prayer heard the echo of God's wails over the destruction and the injustice of God's people being once again made into strangers scattered across an empire. Rabbi Kalonimos Kalman Shapira was the chief rabbi of the Warsaw Ghetto. In a sermon he delivered on Parshat Mishpatim exactly 84 years ago today, he explained this parable. It was only when Rabbi Yosef entered into the devastation of the ruins, letting go somewhat of his self-centeredness, that the boundaries restricting his perception were also destroyed, and he was able to hear the voice of God. Rabbi Yosef must look beyond himself, beyond his own suffering, to hear that God is weeping over Rabbi Yosef's suffering and over all who suffer the indignities of the stranger. This is what we hear when we go to the ruin, to the hard place, to the destroyed place. We hear God weeping, not a loud wail, but quiet, like a dove cooing. We hear its reverberations when we stop and get outside ourselves long enough to listen. In the Midrash, we are told that as the Romans sacked Jerusalem, God was crying in heaven, weeping and saying, "What have I done? I have sent my Shekhinah, my indwelling presence, to the earth, so that my presence might be felt among the people, and now I have withdrawn it. I will go to my private place of concealment, and there I will cry." This is a strange story and hard to parse. But here is how Rabbi Kalonimos Shapira explains it, writing not from the smoldering ruins of Jerusalem, but from the Warsaw Ghetto in 1942 as the world around him burned. If God's weeping over injustice and oppression was to be heard in its full force on earth, it would destroy existence. God's tears would wash away all that is, as they did in the time of Noah. So God has chosen to remove God's self from the world, to spare us the full force of God's sorrow. God retreats into the innermost chamber, and there God weeps so that the world can continue. In the depths of God's own heart, God cries for humanity. This is what Rabbi Yosef finds when he prays among the ruins. This is what Elijah believes is the essence of prayer, the attempt to enter into God's heart and hear God's weeping in small enough amounts that it will not drown us, but like the subtle coo of the dove, it will awaken us. Because God hears the cries of the oppressed, but God cannot leave God's place of concealment to respond, so God needs us to respond. As we pray in the ruins, God's tears will water the stranger's heart that God has placed inside us so that we might go and find other strangers and help them because God can't. God knew the world would be full of strangers, vulnerable and afraid, and so God created the Hebrews, the boundary crossers, the wanderers, the people with the heart of the stranger, so that we might be the ones to help. Why would God sentence God's chosen people to be strangers and sojourners, wanderers and outsiders? Why would God burden us with the heart of a stranger, not for our own benefit, but for the benefit of others? As Rabbi Cantor Angela Buchdahl, first Asian American ordained in North America, explains, when we understand what it feels like to be an outsider, We cultivate a radical compassion for others who have been dismissed. We learn to press past the gatekeepers, turn exclusion into empathy, rejection into resilience. We stumble upon the blessings that come from inhabiting the heart of a stranger. The heart of a stranger is not a burden, but a blessing and a sacred obligation. 36 times the Torah reminds us that we should care for the stranger because we have been strangers. Over and over again in a chilling refrain, remember your experience of oppression so that you might speak for the oppressed. Rabbi Jonathan Sacks writes, "It is terrifying to grasp how seriously the Torah took the phenomena of xenophobia, hatred of the stranger. It is as if the Torah were saying with the utmost clarity, reason is insufficient, sympathy is inadequate, only the force of history and memory is strong enough to form a counterweight to hate." God weeps when human beings oppress each other. But God needs more than tears. God needs action. God made us the perpetual strangers because God needs to act through us. So God placed in us a stranger's heart so that we would see ourselves in others who are oppressed. Every oppressed stranger lifts his eyes to heaven, and God hears him and weeps. Then God turns God's face to us, waiting for us to respond. The voice of God's sadness over suffering and God's hope for humanity whispers through the universe, calling to us like the cooing dove. It says, "Go to the ruins. Look for the people with their tearful eyes lifted to the heavens. Look for the people with no one to speak for them, no one to defend them. And there be God's ears and heart and hands. You who were strangers, who crossed rivers and oceans, who survived slavery and slaughter, persecution and pogrom, do not harden your stranger's heart. Even in a dark time when you are vulnerable and you are a stranger, go and find others and stand together. Go to the ruins and tear down the signs that say any human is unwelcome, any person is anything but beloved. Only then will God wipe away God's tears and emerge from the deepest chambers of concealment and send Shekhinah down to dwell on earth again. You, with the stranger's heart, Lech Lecha, go and be a blessing."